Hi everyone, Mollusk here, and today we're going to do a tier list. Everyone likes tier lists. So I was thinking to myself, what champions do I hate to see across from me in the draft, on the enemy team, or indeed even on my team? So I decided to rate every single champion in League of Legends based on my feelings towards that. I guess you could say it's a tier list of champion threat, or maybe game impact, in particular from the perspective of a low elo player. Obviously there's going to be personal bias, maybe a skew based on the champions that I play. I like to think I'm quite an objective guy, so I do kind of like take into account a team-wide composition, but at the end of the day, it's just a bit of fun. So let's get cracking! As I said, these rankings are my personal feelings, or like how concerned I am when I see them in the game. And there are various factors at play in those feelings, such as them having game-changing abilities that force you to play around them, how reliable or forgiving those abilities or play style are, and the average level of player skill I tend to associate with these champions. And my rankings will go from bottom right as least concern to top left as most concern. So here I'm starting at the very bottom with champions I consider to be God's gift to whoever their enemy's team is. And we probably have some controversy from the word go, as my bottom pick is Pyke. I know a lot of people hate to see this champion against them, and he is one of the few supports that people actually ban. But guys, stop banning Pyke in low elo and take the free win. So don't get me wrong here, I love Pyke. He is straight up one of the coolest concepts, character designs and ability sets in the entire game. His hook, his mobility, his stun combo, his ultimate execute are all things that should deserve respect. The people that play him are generally not even that bad. But none of that matters, because unless he absolutely bodies his opponents in lane, he's totally fucking irrelevant. Even if he does smash lane, by 25 minutes, he's completely irrelevant again. So his window to win the game is really small, and he's completely dependent on his team to do it. Why is this? Well, what does Pyke bring to a team? He brings engage in terms of his hook, and he brings cleanup in terms of his resetting execute. Pyke's hook is actually incredibly slow and telegraphed and has to be used from Fog of War to be effective. This is great for getting picks in early skirmishes where Pyke excels, but it's generally really shit in teamfights, as squishy Pyke has to position dangerously close to the enemy team, land this pretty tricky skill shot, let alone on the right person, use his dash to stun them and get out of there before he immediately gets lit up, and then basically he's got nothing left. His team then have to take on a 4v5 fight whilst he lurks in the background, waiting for people to get low so that he can then like repeat execute them, which even then is a skill shot that's pretty unforgiving to land. And basically if his team's that close to winning a 4v5, then literally any other character would probably be doing more than Pyke. He's a damage orientated character in an elo where most teams do not lack damage but do lack reliable support in terms of like frontline and CC, and he does very little damage to objectives, he can't push waves, he's entirely geared towards snowballing multiple lanes. There is high mobility and extra gold mechanic, but in low elo people generally don't know how to effectively use those leads. The games stall, people get caught out in ridiculous positions that you don't even need a Pyke to take advantage of that. There are repeated ARAM punch-ups in mid, and basically whoever's scaling champions come out on top of those fights tends to win. Wow, I had a lot to get off my chest about Pyke. I love the champion, he's one of my favourite supports, but I see him on the enemy team and I rub my hands together, because unless the player is truly exceptional, the enemy team is basically playing a 4v5. Zyra is next, and probably my second favourite marksman after Kindred. But I see her picked and I essentially write off that bot lane. Because ADC is a hard role to play, she is one of the hardest ADCs to play because of her backloaded damage. And the people that play her are almost always so bad it's griefing. Because no one mains her. She looks really cool so people pick her up to try her out. But her kit and playstyle are finicky and not really pick up and play. I play a lot of Rakan, and I have to explain how the recall passive works almost every time, let alone the W synergy. So yeah, Zyra is almost always free wins for the enemy. Korgmor's up next. You almost never see him, and even when you do, he's never really much of a threat. He typically takes so long to come into his power the game's already over. But he's above Zyra because he's so much easier to play, and if he ever does hit his power spike, he can really shred. Next up is Ophelius, probably the hardest ADC in the game to play. Takes so much practice for low elo players to even point his guns in the right direction, that even if they're good, and actually they tend to not be too bad, the very few that you do see, their mental stack just seems to be so overwhelmed that they tend to make mistakes. But the character's so powerful that if they ever do manage to get to their items, there's a chance just random button mashing will carry them through. But ultimately, I'm just not worried to see him on the opposite draft. Warwick, Warwick, Warwick. The beginner's jungler. Another of one of Riot's coolest character concepts. I will always have a soft spot for him. But I see him picked against me, and it's almost always easy mode. Warwicks are enriched for people relatively new to jungle. And more than probably any other role, jungle depends on knowledge more than champion. It really doesn't take long for most people to get the hang of his powerful, simple and really forgiving early game kit. They tend not to understand or be able to achieve the frenzy of activity they need to be doing before his role drastically changes from, like, invasive hunter to suicide bomb or peel bot, which is highly unforgiving and considerably more challenging to play. And basically no one I encounter in low elo is able to do it. Slightly, and I mean very slightly above Warwick, is Talia. She's fiddly and unforgiving at all stages of the game, far beyond what most casual players can use effectively, but the people who play her tend to have more than beginner knowledge of their role. And getting hit by her full combo will generally just delete pretty much anyone who isn't a tank or a juggernaut. But she takes a while to get going, and as the game drags on, there's more and more opportunities for mistakes or misplays that will hand the enemy the game. Jace, I would put him lower, but he got a bit of a power bump surrounding the Arcane release, which forced me to respect him a teeny bit more. He's a transforming champion, which means he requires hands. Hands are something that low elo players typically struggle to control. His hybrid melee range style requires good spacing, which typically the players don't have. And basically he boils down to an explosive energy ball on a stick. If he wins lane, which he often doesn't without significant help, that can hurt quite a bit if he can hit multiple players with it. It's a lot of ifs. Azir, another champion that probably could go further down this list, but my pet mid laner, for whatever reason, seems to struggle against Azir, and so I often have to deal with unusually fed ones. But it boils down to it's a hard champion, and I've really yet to encounter one that I felt was up to the job. So at the top of the bracket of the champions I'd really rather see on the enemy team, we've got Kalista. Incredibly hard champion to play properly, and an ADC with one of the poorest scaling, because past a certain point her passive hop starts to handicap her actual DPS, and like Zyra, a significant part of her damage is backloaded. And her ult is one of the hardest abilities to coordinate with a stranger in the entire game. She's only this high on the list because I've faced a couple of duos that work together really well, and she was a monster. Let's go to the next tier. These are champions you can generally disrespect. It's not like they're literally working for the enemy team most of the time, as were the ones in the previous tier, but I see people pick these and I'm like, wow, whatever. So at the bottom we've got Varus, immobile ADC, perpetually in the shadow of Riot's nerf bat, because if he even gets a whiff of becoming meta, he infects the entirety of the pro play scene. So yeah, his long range arrow skill shot does pack a punch, his ult is a stun that's quite annoying. Oh my gosh, the players are the most toxic whiny bitches. Perpetually butthurt over something, and tend to do far more damage to their own team's morale than they do to the enemy. Karma is a good all-round enchanter that's probably not too difficult to play if you're used to that kind of style. She seems to get a buff, or the meta seems to favour her at least once per year. At higher level of players at least. But at lower levels, meh. The players generally seem to try, and I had a decent one in one of my recent games. I think it was a gold player. And I don't know if she's supposed to scale, but to me it never seems like she does. After about 25-30 minutes, all her damage seems to fall off and she's just basically a glorified shield bot. Sort of vaguely useful, but not at all scary. And now we come to Nidalee. I really wanted to put her higher. I played her all through pre-season and came to appreciate what she can do, even in unskilled hands. She's a transformer, she's probably one of the most high skill cap champions in the entire game. And that's not really because she's got like 7 abilities, and that makes her complicated, because they all flow together quite intuitively. It's the insanely high actions per minute, positional awareness, and the ability to think about all the other things that are going on in the game at the same time as you're doing that makes it so hard to achieve her potential and really get the most out of her. She really can work in low elo because of her mobility allowing her to get to anywhere that you need to really easily, which makes like not being in the right part of the map at the right time a bit more forgiving. And although she's squishy, if you're playing her even vaguely right, she just doesn't die, because she's so good at escaping from fights she doesn't want to take. She's strong early game, but actually also good in team fights because of the spear. And in low elo, the spear is everything. If you hit that javelin toss from downtown, you basically take out, cripple, or even just outright kill one of the enemy team. And in low elo, people are so bad at dodging, generally because their attention is so overwhelmed by everything else going on. You'll be surprised how many of them find their mark. And when I was playing her, I won so many fights, and in fact games, because people disrespected what she could do. It's a squishy champion, it's too hard to play for, people in bronze. And then they're dead, or I've disappeared over a couple of walls. But ultimately, I had to put her down here because you don't hit those spears, you don't win the game. And realistically, I can't remember the last time I faced a Nidalee that I thought was a problem. Udyr, this guy ruled the jungle for, a good part of Season 11. And he's about to get a rework, so maybe his time in the sun will come again. Basically, he's a high-tempo early game jungler that runs around at Mach 3, stuns you and beats you to death, and gets less and less relevant as the minutes go by. When he's strong, it's oppressive, but most of the time they don't make enough of their early game to be much of a worry. Sejuani can get really, really chunky, and occasionally you run into good ones. But for the most part, I don't find the players are generally that great. And given that most of her CC is gated behind skill shots, and she takes a while to scale up and get to that unkillable chunk, there are a lot of other junglers I'd rather not face than her. So then we've got Rek'sai. In the hands of a good player, Rek'sai is pretty terrifying, with really oppressive gank and invade potential. But her playstyle is so unique it must take a lot of games to get used to. I basically never play against Rek'sais. The entry level is probably somewhere in mid to upper gold, which is a bit above me, where the players are good enough to reliably get a lead on her, and then their teammates are good enough to use that lead to win the game before it goes on too long. Basically, if I see someone pick a Rek'sai, there's a good chance I don't need to be concerned. Olaf, why is Olaf here? I would have thought I put him below Udyr. I think I used to find him scary when I first started playing, but now I sort of find his window of power is so small that I'm never really worried unless I end up fighting him alone. Ryze, just not that scary compared to other mages. He's got CC, his combo hits like a truck. I've even seen them use their ult effectively on occasion to escape or to transport their team across the map for to get to a gank on time. I just can't say I'm particularly worried when I see him. So now we come to Rengar, and it hurts me to put him this far down. He's one of my favourite characters. Beautiful character in the right hands if you watch Dekar 173 or Dopamine or Pussy Poo or De Jure. Notoriously dangerous in the hands of a one trick. And as a Kindred player, let me tell you how unfun this matchup can be if the Rengar's tracking you properly and feeling ill-disposed towards frolicking little lambs. But this is a hard champion to play mechanically and macro effectively. He needs to get a lead early and maintain it, which means he can't just AFK farm and clear his jungle, which is the temptation because he's good at it. You have to be good at tracking the enemy jungler so that you can invade them and set up counter ganks, which lowly elo players often struggle with. You have to have a good eye for wave states so that you can properly lane gank, which even if you do know how to do, chances are your laners don't, and they'll mess it up and waste loads of your time. And then of course there's knowing how to play out the mid to late game, which applies to both Rengar jungle and top, which involves using your ult properly to zone and herd and not jump in and suicidally go one for one. You have to have patience and restraint, awareness of minions, monsters and plants to enable you to get in, get the kill and get out. You have to know how to side lane effectively, but with a kit that's highly conditional on terrain, as you can almost never straight up duel someone in the open. So yeah, Rengar can have a lot of power, and I believe there's a rework coming soon to make him a bit easier to play. But honestly, I can only think of one Rengar I've faced that was a serious threat, and the rest tend to play basically like I used to, where really they rely on their team to survive the laning phase on their own, because their ganks generally aren't that effective. And although they might end up getting quite a few kills from popping squishies, it's really their team that's driving things forward. So yeah, sorry Rengars, I don't really respect you, until you leave me gutted and skinned in front of my blue buff a few times. Haven't got much to say about Karthus. The ult is game changing, but the few I've faced, I don't think I've struggled to hunt and kill into irrelevance. It's a relatively easy matchup for Kindred, so I might be a bit biased there. Quinn, an early game lane bully. If she gets ahead in lane and snowballs, she can be a real pain with her mobility, letting her turn up the pressure on mid lane and the near jungle. But if she doesn't get that lead, she is so useless, and one gank can put her behind. So path to her once or twice early, and your laner can generally handle the rest. No, I faced a few times when I was playing Wukong top, but it's a bit of an unusual playstyle, and it seems like the people that play Gnar rely on you knowing less about what he does than they do, rather than them actually being able to play him to his potential. I've faced a few very fed Mega Gnars, and they aren't a joke, but they're overall much scarier top laners. Fiora, a terror in the higher elos, is just not that much of a problem in low elo. A champion highly reliant on her riposte ability, which takes a lot of experience and matchup knowledge to use effectively. And because low elo players rarely split push well, they tend to overextend and get killed a lot. Ashe feels like the basic default ADC, right? She's actually got a really good kit. I really like some of her abilities. You know, that hawk shot to give vision across the map is broken. Built-in slows and a long-range auto attack, global stunning arrow. There's some good stuff to play with there. So I'd probably rate her a fair bit higher if it wasn't for the fact that she's generally the go-to for people, you know, who are relatively new to the ADC role, otherwise known as walking money bags. Next we've got Allowy, and I think I've misplaced this one. She should be up near the top of this tier. Allowy is a bit of a lane bully that a lot of low elo top laners seem to struggle against. And to be fair, I've had my own share of harsh lessons. But a bit like Fiora, if she doesn't win the lane, then she's just not important. And if she does win the lane, she'll typically over push, get dogpiled and give up her shutdown. Because when Allowy split pushes, she pretty much just wins the fight or dies. There's very little room for escape for her. And whilst beginners might struggle to deal with her ult, low elo isn't just beginners, it's casual players that have played for years and know about certain important abilities like Allowy's ult, which is pretty easy to deal with if you bait her into using it, walk away, and then go back and kill her when it's over. So yeah, because a lot of people do seem to struggle to lane against her, she should be higher, but the counterplay is so easy I just can't give it a lot of respect. Ezreal is a lot like Ashe in that a lot of newer ADCs like him because of how safe and mobile he is, but a lot of Ezreal seem to over-index on that kind of aspect of his kit, and play so safe and passive that they just don't fucking do anything. He's very skill shot reliant, and it's important to keep his passive stacked, which isn't the easiest thing to do. Basically, the average quality of Ezreal players isn't very high, although you do tend to find slightly more better ones than, say for example, Ashe. Corki's a champion. I'm always surprised that anyone plays more than once because his voice is so annoying. And I want to say that when I see him, he's usually on my team for some reason. And maybe even more often than not, he'll do quite well in lane, but then we'll eventually lose. Maybe he's tricky to play, or maybe he's overly reliant on smacking people with his package. I don't know, but I'm really jumping for joy when I see him on my team, and so if I see him on the enemy team, sure. Okay, so Rel, Alistar and Leona I'm going to lump together because I think they basically do this, you know, they're basically the same thing. Big, tanky teamfight engagers. These are champs you should never really be sorry to see on your team, but almost no one plays Rel, especially in low elo. So those that do are probably trying her out, and that generally isn't good for winning games. And she's the most reliant on team coordination of the three. Alistar players tend to be a bit more experienced, a bit better, but his combo is a bit harder to pull off. Getting the right knockback angle or cancelling it effectively for the knockup. It doesn't go right all the time, and although he can take obscene punishment, Alistars often get caught out of position a fair bit and chunked, which reduces their fighting effectiveness. And finally we come to Leona. Leona is a mystery to me. She should be so good. She should be really scary. If I see her on the enemy team, I should be like, damn. Her kit makes her the perfect engaged tank, and she is really quite simple to use. But the Leonas in my games play like trash. I don't know what it is, if it's like she's the entry level engage support, but they miss their Zenith Blades a lot, they're not much better with their ults. But the biggest thing is how out of position they often are. Like, they'll be far up mid lane while the rest of their team's in base. And I was even against quite a decent one the other day. You know, she was being aggressive, she was stunning people out, you know, locking them down, and did end up getting a good number of picks. But she didn't win, and I don't know if it's because her team wasn't following up on her engage well enough, or if, you know, she got out of position. She should be terrifying, but until I experience it, I can't place her higher. Now we get to Brom. My pick for the worst primary position support in the game. I do not understand why anyone would pick this in low elo, and by all rights Brom should be right near the bottom of God's gifts to the enemy tier. But there's Mafia Brom. Mafia Brom is a completely different beast because Mafia Brom is invariably a platinum player, and you will never be able to kill his ADC, and you will have the shit beaten out of you, quite likely just by Brom himself. So yeah, whilst I have no respect for Brom as a champion, if you see him across from you in the draft, there's always a chance it could be Mafia Brom. As we started to get to the top of the list of champions you can pretty much safely disrespect, we come to Kayle. Kales are usually fairly rubbish players. Maybe it's the champion's weak early game that makes them look that way, or maybe it's the fact that they hit level 16 and roll their face on the keyboard and win, so they just don't need to be. In any case, it's hard to find a whinier little bitch than a Kayle player. It actually blows my mind how many people pick this champion only to spam the surrender vote from minute 15 onwards. So yeah, the character's weak early, generally the player's not that good and your top laner can handle them with a minimum assistance. However, like with Ezreal, a certain number of Kayle players can actually turn out to have some skill. Basically, with a Kayle in the game, you're always on a bit of a time limit to win, and there is always the risk that they turn out to be better than your top laner and you're in for a pretty hard game. Just beating Kayle to the top spot of this tier is Malphite. I disrespect Malphite because he is the classic auto-filled top champion. As such, Malphite players are rarely very good. They don't generally generate very much pressure in the top lane, which gives you time as a jungler to work on the rest of the map, and it's not uncommon you can catch them out somewhere they shouldn't be. However, Malphite doesn't really need its player to be good, and the champion to some extent plays itself. As long as their laning phase went better than Apocalyptic, they will always be useful with that ult. So here we get to the tier that, for want of better words, I just call the fair tier. Most of the champions here are generally solid. If the pilot's good, they can give you a run for your money, and generally the game is going to more or less seem fair. There are a few exceptions, however, and these are champions that basically exist at both extremes of the continuum. They can be a nightmare to play against, or the freest wins you ever did see. And it's so random which one you're going to get, that I had to take an average and put them here. We're going to start things off with Riot's newest champion, Renata Glask. She's got a range displacement ability, a revive on a basic ability, and an ultimate that's about the size of a lane that causes enemies to fight each other. In high elo, apparently she's pretty strong, but in low elo, I have not been impressed. I think, she's a new champion, people are still learning how to play her, but really, I see her and I am not in the least bit concerned. Next is Orianna, and she is only here because I play so few games with or against her that I just don't know where to put her. To me, she seems like a good champion, but maybe she's not flashy enough for most mid laners. And if you see an Orianna, my sense is that you're not expecting them to pop off, but you're not expecting them to feed either. I guess it's sort of similar in a way to Victor. Before Arcane, I would have had him in the tier below, but since then, he's had a bit of a surge in power. And some of the ones I've faced more recently have had a bit of muscle to them. But he's generally not that hard to gank or pick off. And he's got good damage, but it's manageable unless he gets really fed. Zilean's pretty much in the same boat as Orianna and Victor, except that for whatever reason, Zilean players seem to try really hard. His bombs do good damage, but the player tends to be trying to do so much that they don't always get the double bomb stun. The players around him don't tend to be good enough to make the best use of their the speed ups, and his ult is obviously great, but in low elo, if someone dies, they're probably in such a bad position that they're just going to get killed again anyway. Severe, in my head, is the worst ADC in the game. Massively reliant on hitting that giant Chakram skill shot, which has an extortionate mana cost, and her ult is basically the Shurelya's battle song in active, which, don't get me wrong, is fantastic on supports, but she's an ADC, and it means your team is missing out on extra damage burst, lockdown, or global threat that this character archetype usually provides. However, she's made it all the way up into this tier, because despite all of that, it doesn't generally seem like her performance is any worse than other kind of typical ADCs. And you often find her duoed with Morgana's for that double spell shield, which is pretty obnoxious against heavy CC teams. Seraphine's next, probably runner-up to the character that I dislike the most in this entire game. She brings some decent CC damage and lane sustain. Her ult is pretty powerful, and it's one of those ones that tends to go under the radar in that you forget about it until it's too late. The players often aren't that good, at best they're okay, so I think here's a good spot for her. You shouldn't be worried to see her, but you shouldn't disrespect her too much either. But you can disrespect the player all the way, because they clearly have no respect for themselves either. Let's talk about Rakan. Handsomest motherfucker on the Rift, my favourite support. Even more fun to play than Pyke, because winning is fun, and we shouldn't ignore that. The Rakan player base has a higher number of Chads than many other supports. They tend to have an above average knowledge of the support role, and are man enough to come out from behind their ADC, move around the map, do some ganks which sometimes don't work out, and get some fucking wards down on the enemy half of the map. In lane, he's not that impressive unless your ADC and your jungler want to play aggressive, and when was the last time that happened? But in mid to late game teamfights, he's a fucking god. If, and generally only if, his team knows how to play around him so he can do his thing. And let's face it, it's low elo. So the engage aspect of his kit is generally pretty gimped, and it's his excellent counter engage which pretty much solo carries him through. So yeah, Rakan. Solid champion, but I can't put him any higher because his threat is generally just so gated by his team. Ornn is a big fat goat man, generally seems solid but not exceptional all round. Players win some, they lose some, I doubt they ever build the special items for their team. A game with Ornn feels like a fair game. Zyra has been one of the better AP carry supports for a while. She's capable of doing a lot of damage, and players often do, and I think a lot of people in low elo struggle to understand that that annoying plant that sat there biting them in the ass as they're fighting really is going to kill them. However, whilst Zyra can hit like a freight train, she is very immobile and very squishy. And the people who play her often have a distorted sense of how big their dick is, or, I don't know, want to become one with the plants in the jungle or something, because they will reliably position far more aggressively than is sane throughout the course of the game. On top of that, they struggle to control their abilities and will take farm from their ADC, mess up wave states, or even steal a buff from the jungler during a leash. Don't get me wrong, they can give really good leashes if they set up their plants, spawn their plants and then just walk away, but if the Zyra is sticking around, you better have your finger on the smite. Maokai, a thick tank with good CC, is welcome on any team in low elo. His saplings are really annoying for the enemy to deal with, and top tip, Nico is a great counter to this, but like everyone we've had so far, you're not really sitting up in your seat if you see him. Twisted Fate, you have to respect the gold card and the ult. 80% of the time, the player's not that great and not much of a threat. Pulls the wrong card, ults the wrong play, but every now and then, you find one that knows what they're doing, and it can be a bit oppressive. Akshan generally isn't much of an issue unless he gets really fed. The players are at best okay. I'm really wowed by the use of their grappling hook, but perma stealth is a big deal in low elo, where a lot of people are wandering around just asking to be ambushed, and obviously his revive, which isn't as straight up game imploding as I thought it would be. It's something that obviously can change the game the longer it goes. Renekton, odds are on the side of him winning the lane slightly more often, which puts a bit more pressure on his enemies early in mid game. Games he loses or goes even in lane, he's almost never a threat. And games he gets a lead, he can be tough, but if the enemy have any sort of decent scaling, and most elo teams tend to, and can drag the game past 30 minutes, then he's not really much of a threat. Kaiser and Jin are pretty run-of-the-mill ADCs. They're decent in lane, they scale well, they have generally high popularity, there are probably more Jin players than Kaiser players. Kaiser players tend to be slightly better, but Jin's kit is more forgiving and less risky. He also has a couple of abilities with long-range CC, which is always fantastic. Above them I've got Ziggs. Ziggs I don't see that often, and the players don't tend to be very good. There probably aren't that many Ziggs mains. But the champion's got good damage and zoning, and you can't leave him alone with a tower. At a pretty much the same level of threat we've got Misfortune. Now loads of people play Misfortune, she's a very beginner character, so you can run into really shit ones. But you do get people who like a gratuitously over-exaggerated female form enough to put some time into her, and I'm not really sure how because I get seasick just watching her wiggle around. So every now and then you can encounter a strong one. But ultimately they don't really even need to be that good. If they can get a decent ult off into the middle of a team fight, you can't really get away with disrespecting it. Volibear players tend to be not too bad. Their champion is so strong early, they tend to get decent advantages fairly regularly. Top laners tend to be stronger and better, but take longer to influence the map than junglers. And whilst they tend to be more reliable than Renektons and useful for longer, it ends up being the same sort of thing, whereas if their team can't pull together and put the game away, they just sort of fall off. Trundle is very similar to Volibear, except the junglers tend to be better, and it's the jungle role that tends to have more impact on the game, and I feel like Trundle scales slightly better. He absolutely eats towers if he gets to them, and that's not something to ignore. Xin Zhao's a very powerful early game jungler who can hold on to his lead quite well throughout the mid game. He's got good engage for his team, and his ult is really annoying to deal with, but frankly I haven't really struggled against any I've faced recently. So long as you're aware of his range and roughly what he wants to do, and space accordingly, it's not too difficult to deal with, and often they'll get too aggressive or impatient and go in at the wrong time. Talon players are annoying, but they're generally not quite good enough to take all the fights they do, and they end up getting caught out eventually. The champion's kit makes him reliably dangerous though, and the one-shot potential is real if they get fed. Seraphines can be a bit annoying. Most of the time they're not very good players, but occasionally you do run into the good ones. And then the enemy team just won't die. Senna is basically the same thing, except the players tend to be slightly better, and her CC is a bit more straightforward to use than Seraphines. Nautilus players tend to be extremely aggressive and not very clever. The bad ones will soft int by anchoring a wall and pulling themselves into the enemy team. I see him as sort of like the entry-level hook support. For players who want this playstyle, realise they're not winning any games on Pyke but aren't good enough to play Thresh. The champion offers everything a low elo team needs from a support. He's a wall, he's got engage, he's got so much CC, but the average player quality means I can't justify putting him further up this list. Thresh has one of the best kits of any support. It's got engage, disengage, counter engage, peel, shields, a bit of range, chunkiness and a bit of damage. They generally build mobility boots, are surprisingly quick on their feet and have strong roaming. I feel like supports in low elo don't tend to main characters, at least to the extent that maybe other laners do. Having the right tools for the game is very important to the role, and many of the meta champions aren't that mechanically demanding, so you can basically pick them up after, not have to play that many games and be functional on them. But Thresh breaks this mould. He probably has the highest skill cap of any support champion, and I get the sense there are a decent number of Thresh mains out there. But ultimately, even if they're otherwise quite good, low elo players struggle to be able to handle Thresh, and even if they can, a lot of his power comes from his teammates playing correctly off him, which often they don't. For most intents and purposes, Jarvan is basically Xin Zhao. I don't really know why I've put him a bit higher. Maybe it's because I get the sense that they tend to think a little bit more than Xin's, rather than just abusing the champion's power. There's not a lot of daylight between them though. Shyvana is quite a noob-friendly jungler. She power farms, turns up to spit a fireball at a team and then fucks off back to the jungle. If she's on the enemy team, they play like they're fucking nymphos for lizards, and if she's on your team, the rest of your team just haven't... What's a dragon? So she basically tends to skew the game towards bot side, and you have to prepare accordingly for that. And I don't know, the recent Shyvanas I've run into have been quite strong, so she's definitely not something I can just disrespect anymore. Senna, loads and loads of people play Senna. So she runs into the issue of having a large player base where there are lots of bad players, but there are a decent number of good players. In low elo games, damage supports are pretty valuable, because while CC is king, people often miss or don't follow up on it appropriately. And at the end of the day, damage is damage, and if someone on your team has fallen behind and not contributing, supports like Senna offer one extra person that can potentially pick up that slack. She's got decent laning and infinite scaling, so yeah, very common average threat. Lucian is like the Renekton of bot lane, but getting ahead in bot lane impacts the game more than in top lane. Players tend to be okay, but their effectiveness slowly falls off as the game goes into its later stages. The threat level is fair enough, and I don't often see the Lucian Nami bot lane, which is supposed to be pretty good. Camille has a high skill ceiling, good scaling, paired with decent laning, and a kit that makes her quite versatile. She's often solid, but rarely a terror. Aatrox is a champion you see every now and then, usually at times when lifesteal items have been buffed. Overall, he's not that difficult a champion to play, but learning to hit his Q effectively does take a bit of practice, I can see. Usually the players are okay, occasionally you get the ones that pop off and become unkillable, but then sometimes you also get the ones that just flub. Bard is a double-edged sword. He's one of the hardest supports to play. He relies on heavy roaming to get the most out of him, which often leaves his ADC in shit creek, because not many low elo ADCs know how to play 1v2. But if you can get things working with his jungler and or mid, the warding and ganking and slipperiness is really annoying, and seems to work out just about as much as it doesn't. For people that can lower themselves to playing Gragas, he seems to be relatively effective. He can put out decent damage, he's got CC and displacement, and he can be fairly tough to kill. Gragas players usually play quite confidently, but they're not really a game-carrying threat. Yuumi, I don't even want to talk about this champion. It is the worst character design in the game, possibly in any game. If the enemy bot lane lacks CC and her ADC plays with any kind of confidence, she's not even that bad in lane. But what it boils down to really is someone on her team getting fed, and does she have the skill to right-click on them? So basically, Yuumi is a total coin flip. Next we get to Wukong, and I don't know why we don't see this guy more. He's just a really solid top laner who can flex into mid and jungle really easily. His kit is stupidly fun to play, and he's easily my favourite meta top laner if you don't count Rengar. He's got really strong laning, a decent side lane game, great team fight. His damage and durability do fall off towards the later stages of the game, but his kit's got the tools to help him work around it. I think overall the few players you see that do play Wukong don't actually tend to be that good, and he generally just seems to lack impact, so I can't, despite my bias, put him any higher. Namis tend to be surprisingly ferocious. With good CC and sustain options, they really pair well with kind of early lane bullies. But I find their power does tend to fall off a bit later due to their relatively short range. The players that play them are generally, I'd even say, above average, especially for enchanters. But yeah, if you get through the lane, they're not really that much of a problem. Caitlyn is the classic ADC lane bully. She's got the highest auto attack range in the game, good poke that goes through waves. Her traps are a death sentence if you stand on them, particularly in the late game, and she can control bushes with them. If she ults you, you better hope you've got Zhonya's or a less important teammate nearby. The players don't need to be that good to be effective, but she's so common that people are just used to facing her. Samira is a potentially powerful champion. If she gets early kills and keeps up momentum, she can snowball like an avalanche. But if the jungler doesn't play for her, or if she plays too timidly, she never really gets going and becomes totally useless. She can't just sit back and mindlessly farm for 40 minutes like most ADCs. Tied in with this, managing her stacks is a bit fiddly, and so you're never quite sure if the player is going to pull through on their mad assaults. Zeri probably fits in somewhere around Samira. The champion's abilities are overloaded, Riot. She just has too much in terms of high damage, mixed damage, movement speed, terrain scaling, shielding, area of effect attacks, and resilience due to the fact that she builds bruiser items. The only reason why she's not in the highest tiers of this whole ranking list is because she's relatively new, and so people haven't learned how to play her properly yet, and because she is so skill shot reliant. That low elo is a gigantic nerf for her because she's literally missing half her damage. Sion is an infinitely scaling tank that does a decent amount of damage, and basically is one of the champions that it doesn't matter how much he loses lane by. He can be 0-5 or 5-0, and he's still going to be doing the same thing, just a little faster the more fed he is. And that is relentlessly pushing down a side lane until there are no more towers left, or running into the middle of the enemy team and causing a massive amount of mayhem. And basically it comes down to, did he feed his laner enough to win the game, or does the team he's against have a health tank shredder like Lilia or Vayne? His threat rating is reduced a bit more by the fact that a lot of Sion players in low elo seem to be on heavy drugs. Riven is a powerful but complicated champion. No one in low elo can play her to her full potential, but they don't need to. Riot's need to sell skins and keep the Riven player base happy is enough for them to keep her stats high enough to be viable in the lower ranks. Granted, most Riven players are bad enough that you can sort of get away with disrespecting them, but if they're good or lucky enough to get a few early kills, it can take an entire team to bring them down. Kanen's a champ you don't see very often. He's quite tricky or unforgiving to play, at least in the laning phase, but he's also relatively safe in terms of, he's quite difficult to gank. And then his mid to late game gets a bit more straightforward, as he's basically fiddlesticks in that he waits over in the fog of war and a flank to flash ult into a team fight. So whilst he is potentially quite powerful, most people aren't good enough at playing him to, be much of a concern. Gwen is a decent top laner. She can flex to mid and jungle. Her laning's not bad and her scaling's good. She's particularly good against teams that rely on range or skill shots, because Gwen is immune, as well as any of her team around her, and being able to bring some AP to top lane helps compensate for all the assassins and AD champs that people like to play in mid and jungle. So yeah, she's fair enough, but you've got to play around her miss and try not to let her scale too hard. Diana is a fairly simple to play AP hybrid fighter assassin, who basically yo-yos between being relevant or not, depending on whoever it is plays her on the balance team gets their way in a board meeting. At the moment she's strong, so she's up the list. Simple to play, fast and brainless clear, high damage makes her good for low elo. But player ability always lags behind the champion's power, so I'm never really that worried when I see her. Annie should be a very frightening character. Her range and damage are surprisingly high, and her burst combo basically doesn't have counterplay. She's good in lane, good in team fights, scales really well. I think she has a reputation for being easier to play than she is, but she isn't that complicated. She suits low elo so well, and high elo, so I just can't justify putting her lower down on this list. But Annie players are so bad. She's like the beginner's mid laner. She's not very cool. I can understand why people don't stick with her, but yeah, You see her and you should be afraid, but you just aren't. Rumble's a champion you don't see that often. He comes in and out of meta. He's resilient, does good damage, and I swear his ult's on like a 10-second cooldown. And Rumble players seem generally decent and probably benefit from the fact that not many people know what he does. Gangplank is a difficult champion to play, but there are a fair number of people that seem to main him, which raises the average ability. He scales really hard and can do some unbelievable damage from some like interesting angles between his ult and his barrels. You really don't want this guy getting fed in lane, but he's tricky enough that you're generally in with a shot of shutting him down. Lux is probably one of the most popular champions in low elo. I don't understand it myself, but there's presumably something about it that calls to people. And the player's skill range is between like thunder shit and quite good. You expect to see her nearly every game, and it's not like she's at all scary. She won't win games by herself, but you just can't ignore her abilities. They're all on stupidly short cooldowns, they do a lot of damage, she's got fantastic wave clear, she can bully in lane, the Binding Light ability ruins ganks and engages. It's literally the main ability you should be focusing on in most fights that involve her. You can never quite relax when securing an epic monster when she's alive, and you can't take a piss in the jungle without that ult blasting through every 20 seconds. Teemo. An infamous bugbear in League, this little rat is one of the most negative play experiences on the Rift. He's often relatively high on the low elo ban list, and can be an obnoxious lane bully, who's difficult for many junglers to gank because they have to wade through a sea of mushrooms just to get to the lane. Top tip, gank a Teemo from the lane, not the river. And then he just runs away with his ridiculous move speed or sits and hides invisibly in a bush, and if you don't have AoE abilities, good luck doing anything. So yeah, I've put him up this high out of respect for the fact of how irritating he is. But that's just it. Teemo is just irritating the vast majority of the time. I'm not saying he can't carry, I'm not saying he can't do anything for his team, but if he doesn't get to set up an area with his mushrooms, or if they manage to get swept out, then his usefulness to his team drastically drops. And he's just a squishy blind bot. So yeah, if you respect the fact there's a Teemo in the game, you can take away a lot of his power by sweeping, buying control wards, and not walking through bottlenecks where Teemo's likely been in the area recently. The world is a sad place, and there are quite a lot of people with such low self-respect that they actually do play Teemo. There are really good ones around, but most of them aren't, and they mainly rely on cheesing people who haven't worked out how to deal with them yet. Taric. Nobody plays Taric. You almost never ever see him. I can't believe he's particularly stimulating to play. He's chunky, he's got stuns and healing, I think maybe a shield. He can make his whole team invulnerable for a short period. But basically his entire kit is really reactive. He depends entirely on his team doing stuff that he can play off of, and having the coordination to play off of his abilities in turn. Basically when you see Taric you know something's up. No normal person plays him, so there's some sort of gimmick afoot, be it a Master Yi funnel or like an unkillable teamfight death ball, which would just start to raise your concern. Elise is quite a hard champion to play, but has quite a specific and relatively powerful playstyle when you can get it to work. Elise players are often better than average, but capped by their champions. I mean, it's not poor scaling, it's just that their abilities become less functional or less kind of useful as the game goes on. It's the low elo problem all early game oriented champions face. So her position here is mostly based on the players playing her, and if they're duoing, it can be a real nightmare. I faced an Elise Malzahar duo that I just couldn't move in my jungle without them being in a bush. Now these next two I might be a bit biased towards, as Kindred is my favourite champion and my main, and Lilia is my main champion for if I need AP in the jungle. I just realised how that sounds. So Lilia is not really a very good solo queue champion. She's a farming jungler, which means that your laners have to sort of fend for themselves a bit in the early game, which they don't like doing. And then when the late game rolls around and she's strong, she is a bit unforgiving. It's not really very clear to her team when she's going in or how she wants to play a fight, and if she gets caught, she's dead. I play her because I need AP, the movement speed feels really good, and the AoE damage from that Q is so satisfying. I've rated her up here because despite the fact she's not actually that good at winning games, She almost always is a bit of a problem for the enemy team, and her usual build of Leandri's Anguish and Demonic Embrace on top of her passive burn means that if you just even get clipped by her, it can take off half your health. And this melts tanks as well. Her Swirl Seed Bowling Ball has enormous range, basically it just goes until it hits something, has an interesting lob effect which can catch people out if they're not paying enough attention. Hitting a 5-man sleep is obviously the dream, haha, see what I did there? And again, it's something the enemy really have to respect, but it's not that easy to do. It requires a Flash Q R Zhonya's combo, and you won't believe the number of champions that have abilities that can get out of this. And really, it's much easier to try to catch someone with low mobility alone and murder them 1v1. Basically, a game against Lilia is usually a hard slog in some form or another. Let's talk about Kindred. So, coolest champion in the game, obviously. But why have I got her up here above all these other champions? I don't get the sense that people really respect Kindred very much. They're never banned, and yeah, like I get the impression that people see Kindred picked against them and they're like, ha 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 ha. Marksman that likes to wander around alone in the forest. That normally only goes one way. And I can't really blame them because most of the Kindreds you see tend to be rubbish. They're not a highly mechanically demanding champion like, say, Nidalee. But if you don't know how to position, you can't play. And developing that positional awareness takes a bit of time. So everyone probably knows that Kindred scales extremely well. It's not quite infinite scaling because I think the game has a hard cap for range and attack speed. But regardless, a Kindred that's nearing full build with 10 plus marks is a real monster. But this scaling is dependent on getting these marks. And the pursuit of these marks encourages Kindred players to make risky invades or take risky fights. And when you believe, just like Shyvana and her dragons, playing Kindred makes the entire enemy team camp sequencing savants, and which they take the marked camp on spawn or are there to create an ambush. Whilst the Kindred's team have literally never seen a Scuttle Crab in their entire lives before. Kindred players and even Master Plus have to explain to their team that they don't need to take the last hit of a jungle camp in order to acquire the mark. So low elo Kindreds, good luck! So yeah, we've got a squishy, unforgiving to play little marksman running around on their own, predictably inting for enemy jungle camps. Not very scary, I grant you. But consider this, Kindred is one of the junglers with the strongest level 2 and level 3 power spikes. And their first clear is very versatile, so they can potentially invade or gank anyone, anywhere, at pretty much any time. A Kindred with a red buff has a good chance of getting a kill or burning a summoner. And if the first 5 minutes go well, which the champion has the power to achieve, Kindred is an insane snowballer, which low elo players typically find difficult to deal with. They have flexible item builds and rune options, and Lamb's Respite is a game-changing ultimate that counters the class that otherwise counters marksmen, assassins. So putting this strong early game, potentially strong mid game, and strong late game together, we've got a champion with a lot of potential to hard carry a game, even in low elo where support from laners isn't something that can be relied on. So yeah, I'm biased towards Kindred, but that's my take. So now the concern meter is starting to rise slightly. We get Cassiopeia, a very powerful carry mage in the right hands. She can't be allowed to get strong and is only this far down our tier list because the people that play her tend to be just trying her out and not very good at her. I am nerd about putting Ahri this high, but she had a rework recently which has bumped her power level considerably. And unlike Cassiopeia's, many Ahris I've faced actually tend to be, not bad. I've faced some platinum ones that just destroyed my team. So yeah, maybe my view is skewed because I do know that she attracts beginners. Draven is the premier smurfing ADC. He's one of the hardest marksmen to play, but will absolutely bulldoze a lane if you give him the opportunity. However, the counterplay to Draven is really quite simple. Just don't fight him. Sit and farm under your tower. Maybe if your jungler happens to be in the area, ping for a gank, but basically at all costs don't die. And if you do that for long enough, it basically doesn't matter how good the player playing him is. They will have a real struggle on their hands to be relevant in the game. Brand should be one of the more dangerous damage supports, but he doesn't go high on the list because of the fact that the players just aren't very good. The vast majority of them anyway. They can bully a lane and devastate team fights later, especially with their ult pinging backwards and forwards between the entire team. But they're so immobile, and similar to Zyra, overly aggressive, that they usually end up dying a lot. And it really is only because of how devastating that ult is that I have him so separated from Zyra. Nikos are a bit of a rare breed. You don't see them very often at all, but when you do, they tend to know what they're doing. Otherwise, the champion is just a harder to play Lux. But yeah, paying the Nico a bit of respect is generally not a bad idea. Dr. Mundo can scale into an obscene tank and take unbelievable amounts of punishment, especially now since his rework and he's got, is it that passive? Was it goes where he pleases? The thing that basically makes him immune to CC half the time. He's really simple to play, and if the enemy team don't have the tools to deal with him, like heal cuts or percent health damage, he's a reliable pain in the arse, so long as he plays with confidence. Kled is basically a similar thing, except that not as many people play Kled, so not many people know how to deal with him as well, and he's much more mobile. But whilst Kled and Mundo can both be a pain, the solution to them is often just buying the right items. Seeing a Shen in the game means that you should start sitting up and start paying a little bit more attention. Everyone loves having a Shen on their team. He's one of the strongest pre-6 top laners in the right hands. And then when he's got his ultimate, every fight needs to be a check as to where's the Shen, when did he last use his ult. He doesn't really carry games, but he can make his team impossible to stop. Warwick is quite a common ban I see nowadays, because of how unpleasant he appears to be to lane against and his absolutely relentless split pushing. I've never personally found him too much of a problem, because even if he gets fed, it's low elo. They will overstay and overpush a lane, and you turn up with the squad and kill them. But it does require the squad. Nunu is one of the easiest junglers to play and one of the most effective. He brings a really solid front line to his team, but is also really mobile and can get off good engages with that snowball, and does surprising damage as well, especially if he starts to build a few AP items. He's got loads of CC, even a knock-up for Yasuo's, Premier objective control with Q Smite, and obviously he's a low economy tank that plays for laners with particularly a relentless early game ganking pressure. The problem is he's really reliant on his team to carry him over the line, and sometimes having 30 assists just isn't enough for them. Also, there are a surprisingly high number of trolls among the Nunu ranks. Part of the cult of the Disco Nunu, no doubt. I've got Zac next, and he could probably go further up. The players tend to not be that bad, and he has extremely good engage that's highly telegraphed for his team, but not necessarily for the enemy team. Lots of CC, great ability to tank, and a surprising damage output for a tank. You're never really sorry to see a Zac on your team, and whilst alarm bells aren't ringing when you see him against you, you do have to account for the way that he's going to play and hopefully try to invade him early. Because he has really strong scaling, percent max health damage is your friend here. Next we have Aurelion Sol, one of the rarest beasts on the Rift. So few people play him, but the ones that do generally seem quite experienced. He takes advantage of the fact that most people don't seem to know what he does very well, and he has really strong roams. But although the players may be stronger than average, the champion itself doesn't seem to present that great a problem. Qiyana is a really difficult champion to play. I don't know why people try it in low elo, but she is super strong, but also fairly OP in the right hands. The denizens of low elo generally don't have those hands, so it's all fine. But the invisibility, stun, and massive AoE ultimate, combined with her assassin damage, is enough to make it work apparently. Low elo Qiyana players have generally practiced enough to match their peers playing easier champions, so yeah, you have to watch your step a bit around them. Top of this group, we've got Jinx. Now, ADCs generally aren't very scaly, for one thing because there's just not that many champions that play the role comparatively, so you tend to get used to most of them. But of the common ADCs you see, Jinx is probably the most dangerous. Samira can spike higher, and maybe when people get better at Zeri, she might take a higher spot. But season in and season out, Jinx's hyper carry potential means there's always a slight worry in the back of your mind as of what if my bot lane feed that Jinx? Because once she gets rolling and has any kind of pill, it's really hard to get her to chill the fuck out. So as this is taking so much longer to get through than I thought it would, we're going to call this the end of part 1 and then make a new separate video for part 2, where we will reveal the champions that low elo players should be worried about when they see them in the draft. Until then, take care.